You may remember that game that you played probably in high school. When we played it, we called it What Happened. I don't know what you called it. It's a situation where it's a game where one person gives a situation and the other people have to guess why that situation came about. For example, the policeman entered the den of the house. Eleanor was lying on the floor dead in a puddle of water. Simon was standing and watching. The policeman was convinced that Simon caused Eleanor's death, and yet he did nothing. What happened? Now you get to ask questions, a limited number of questions until you figure out what happened. Of course, Simon is the policeman's cat. And the policeman came into the den and saw Simon standing there, and Eleanor is a goldfish lying in the puddle on the floor because the cat knocked the goldfish bowl off, and so that's kind of how the game is played. What happened? Sometimes I think that we don't get the whole story when we read the Gospels. In fact, I know we don't. We didn't get the whole story when God gave the law either. We have this story in Luke's Gospel. Now, those of you who have read Luke all the way through, which some of us have done recently in our study of the Gospels, they were told to read the Gospel lesson all the way through before we discussed it. And if you do that, you get an idea in Luke's Gospel that Jesus does not like the Pharisees. He treats them pretty bad. He says things about them that are not particularly complimentary. And he calls them all kinds of names and stuff. Now, it sounds like Jesus thinks that the Pharisees are the bad guys. And you might get that idea as well, that the Pharisees are the bad guys if you take Luke's word for it. And you might get the idea that Jesus didn't like the Pharisees. Both of those would probably be bad assumptions. First of all, the Pharisees were not the bad guys. The Pharisees were very good guys. These were the ones who had gone to all of the trouble of interpreting the law of Moses so that they could follow the law. I think I've said to you before that the law of Moses is not very self-explanatory. For example, it says, don't work on the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't explain what that means. Does it mean don't harvest your crops? Probably. It means that, and you're not supposed to put your animals to work on the Sabbath. But can you take your ox down to the water on Sabbath? That's sort of like work, but the ox needs water. So you got to know. So the Pharisees developed this oral law, the law that interprets the law of Moses. What is work? What if you're just hungry on the Sabbath and you go out and you get some grain and you rub it between your hands and you eat it? Does that work? Well, it's sort of like harvesting, but somebody's got to make a decision, right? So throughout the centuries, the Pharisees, what developed as the Pharisees, developed this oral law. And they did it so that they could follow the law that God had given. What's wrong with that? Why did Jesus break so bad on these guys? And there's another question, by the way. The story that we read today is the third dinner invitation that Jesus has gotten from a Pharisee. There's one in chapter 7, there's one in chapter 11, and this one's in chapter 14. If Jesus was so ugly to them, why'd they keep inviting him back? I mean, I don't get it. It doesn't make much sense until you consider a couple of possibilities. Number one, when do you get maddest at your children? You get maddest at your children when they know what to do and they don't do it. Or when they know what not to do and they do it. Right? Why? Because they know better. Surely our anger is kindled when our kids do something, and my daddy used to say, "You know better than that." Did your daddy ever say that to you? You know better than that. I see some heads nodding here. You know better than that. And the truth is, I did. It may be that Jesus got so upset with the Pharisees because they know better than that. They know better than to think that just because you read the laws and you say, "I did that one, check, did that one, check, did that one, check. Now I can go live like I want to." And Jesus, with his life, said, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work by just following the rules. You have to understand that the rules are there to guide you into a right relationship with God and with other people and with nature and the world and the creation. That's what the purpose of the law is, after all. The law was given when the children of Israel came out of their slavery in Egypt. Now, a slave has about zero responsibility. He has to get up in the morning, he has to brush her teeth, and that's about it. Other than that, they just do what they're told. So when the slaves came out of Egypt, they didn't know how to be a community. They didn't even remember very much, 400 years later, about right worship. They remembered some, but they didn't remember very much, and God had to tell them over again what all the worship was supposed to be like. And so when the law was given, it was God's greatest gift, because it taught the people how to love God and how to love each other. Wow! What could be better than that? So skip forward a couple of thousand years, and here's Jesus talking to the Pharisees and saying, you ought to know better than this. Invite people who can't repay you, because that's the way you demonstrate that you love God, because you love other people. That's idea number one. Idea number two, y'all should sit down for this. Idea number two is that it may be that Jesus was a Pharisee. It may be that Jesus was as interested in keeping the real law of God as anybody else was. In fact, I'm pretty sure of it. In fact, if you read Matthew's gospel, Jesus was all about keeping the law. Not all about ticking off the points of the law, but all about keeping the reason for the law. Jesus said in Matthew's gospel, Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law. Well, what's the fulfillment of the law? What was the reason for the law? Why did God give the law in the first place? Well, it's because God loved us, for crying out loud. God loved the people so much that God wanted the people to know how to appropriately act in God's presence and in the presence of each other. How do you take care of the community? How do you take care of the fields? How do you take care of each other? How do you take care of your relationship with God? So now maybe Jesus' words take on a little bit different note, a little bit different tone. You know, I have a thing that I say to Beth when I'm about to say something that she's not going to take well. For example, I say, sweetie, you told me that when you stay up after midnight, You don't feel well in the morning. It's after midnight, and I don't want you to be unhappy. I don't want you to be unhappy. That's the thing I say when I try to tell her something she should do. We don't generally tell each other what we should do. Certainly don't tell each other what we're allowed to do or can do. We don't even tell each other what we should do, generally speaking. But I tell her, I don't want you to be unhappy, and it's after midnight. And I smile sweetly and give her a little kiss on the cheek and say, I'm going to bed. Jesus says to the people, to the Pharisees in this story, I don't want you to be unhappy. You see, if you invite your family and the rich people and the functionaries in your community and all of that, two things happen. Number one, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and the humble will be exalted. But the other thing is, they turn around and invite you. And what good is that? I mean, here's one rich person inviting another rich person to dinner, and the other rich person invites the one rich person to dinner, and what have you got? Zero. But when you give a luncheon or a dinner or a banquet, you should invite the lame and the blind and the poor, because they cannot repay you. And at the resurrection of the righteous, I don't want you to be unhappy. Do you see? Now, why would Jesus do this? Why would he do it to the Pharisees, with the Pharisees who know better than that, who ought to know better than that? I think he did it because he loved them. What would it be like? I mean, the Pharisees are this close to righteousness. I mean, they're this close, and Jesus recognizes that. They do better than anybody else at keeping the law. He recognized that. He said, you tithe mint and cumin. You tithe everything you get. That's wonderful, and you are this close to being righteous. And Jesus probably thought that if he could just get the Pharisees to go that extra step and let themselves be ruled by the heart, by the law of the heart, rather than the law of stone written on the tablets, they might actually convince all of Israel to be a righteous people. We sang in that first song, I will take their heart of stone and give them hearts for love alone. That's a line straight from Ezekiel. What it says is, the stone tablets took you only so far. You now have to have the law written on your heart. You have to have it inscribed in the place where you live. That way, you will do what's necessary. Oh, what would it be like, sisters and brothers? What would it be like if the heart of this people were made for love alone? Would we be able to teach all of Friendswood how to love alone? Would we be able to model and provide examples of how we are to live with God and with each other and with the creation? Oh my gosh, the mind boggles. Jesus says, brothers, Pharisees, I don't want you to be unhappy. I want you to live in love. Jesus is one of the few people in history to get it. That the name of the game is not following the rules. Not that Not following the rules is the name of the game, but the name of the game does not involve only following the rules. It involves living from your heart and seeing other human beings, every one of them, as creatures of God, the image of God, and people made for God to love, and therefore made for us to love. Jesus goes to the house of a Pharisee for dinner. He says, don't arrange the seating like that. Don't invite these people to dinner. What happened? Love happened.